A round map of a city is shown. A large steepled building is in the center of the circle. Smaller buildings, roads, farmlands, waterways, parks, people, animals, locations of fires, and areas with teepees circle the steepled building throughout the map. Figure 4-1 Vienna in 1529. Sultan Suleiman I's attempted conquest of Vienna in 1529, the year before this panoramic map of the city was made, sent shockwaves across Europe. The building in the center of this detailed view is St. Stephen's Cathedral, which served as an informal headquarters for the defense of the city. Credit: modification of work, panoramic view of Vienna during the First Turkish Siege, 1529, by Vienna Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Chapter outline. 4.1 A connected Islamic world. 4.2 The Ottoman Empire. 4.3 The Safavid Empire. In 1526, the Ottoman armies of Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent, defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs, setting the stage for a showdown with the Habsburgs, the rulers of Austria, at Vienna. In May 1529, Suleiman's army of approximately 100,000 soldiers set out from the Black Sea through the spring rains for the culmination of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe under his reign. Though somewhat weakened by the loss of equipment to heavier-than-expected rain, they reached the walls of Vienna in September and began the siege. Despite being greatly outnumbered, however, the Viennese defenders were able to repulse each of the Ottoman advances. Figure 4.1. Eventually, Suleiman was forced to admit defeat and retreat to Constantinople, the former capital of the Byzantine Empire that was also commonly referred to as Istanbul, Greek for "to the city." Although the 1529 siege of Vienna was a failure for the Ottomans, their bold move greatly alarmed kingdoms across Europe. It also led Suleiman to direct his attention east toward Iran and control of Mesopotamia, areas he thought more important for the security of his existing territory. By the end of his life in 1566, the Ottoman Empire was near the height of its power and territorial control. However, it was not the only large Muslim state to dominate Eurasia. The Safavids in Iran also expanded Islamic military, political, and economic power in the region we call the Middle East. This is a timeline of important events covered in this chapter. 1300. Osman I establishes Ottoman Empire. An image of a man seated in a throne in a colorful robe and turban is shown surrounded by people, and a large black animal is shown. 1453. Ottomans capture Constantinople. 1492. Expulsion of Jewish people from Spain. 1501. Safavid Empire founded. 1529. Ottomans besiege Vienna. A circular map is shown of a city with buildings and terrain. 1533. Sultanate of Women begins with Hurrem Sultan. An image of a woman in a red dress and an ornate head dress is shown. 1555. Peace of Amiens established. 1577. Taqi al-Din invited to build Istanbul Observatory. An image of people in an observatory is shown. 1606. Holy Savior Cathedral built in Isfahan. An image of the inside of a large, ornately decorated cathedral is shown. Figure 4.2 Timeline. The Islamic world. Credit: 1300. Modification of work Osman Ghazi I by Sayed Lockman / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit: 1529. Modification of work Panoramic view of Vienna during the First Turkish Siege, 1529 by Vienna Museum / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit: 1533. Modification of work Portrait of Roxolana, Cowram by Jack Amrin Collection, Istanbul / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit: 1577. Modification of work Istanbul Observatory in 1577 by Cahiers de Science et Vie No 114 / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit: 1606. Modification of work Armenian Frescoes by David Stanley / Flickr, CC by 20. A map of the world is shown. A red box includes southeastern Europe, Central Asia, northwestern Africa, and India. Figure 4. 3 Locator Map, the Islamic World. Credit, Modification of Work World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the factors that characterized and often united the Muslim Ummah after 1500. Explain the relationships among politics, religion, technology, and trade in the Islamic world after 1500. Analyze the impact of Islamic political and legal institutions on the larger Muslim community, beginning with its emergence during the life of the Prophet Muhammad at the beginning of the 7th century CE. The religion of Islam spread far and wide for several centuries and led to the establishment of several caliphates, areas under the control of Muslim rulers called caliphs. Early expansion occurred largely through conquests, such as those undertaken by the Prophet himself, the Rashidun Caliphate, the name given to the rule of the 4 caliphs who succeeded Muhammad, and the Umayyad Caliphate, which emerged decades after Muhammad's death and was ruled by the Umayyad dynasty based in Syria. These conquests expanded the Ummah, or the community of Muslims, into Iran, Spain, and the vast lands in between. In 750, the Umayyad Caliphate succumbed to rebellion and gave way to the Abbasid Caliphate. This dynastic transformation not only led to the elevation of Baghdad as the capital of the Abbasid world, but it also brought with it a larger political division in the Islamic world. The Umayyads in Spain refused to recognize the new Abbasid rulers and eventually established their own rival caliphate. In the centuries that followed, other parts of the Islamic world did the same. By the year 1000, there were 3 rival caliphates: the Sunni Abbasids ruling from Baghdad, the Shiite Fatimids ruling from Cairo, and a rival Sunni caliphate, the Umayyads, ruling from Cordoba in Spain. Over the next few centuries, a combination of trade and conquest expanded the Ummah into West Africa and India. The arrival of the Mongols in the 13th century resulted in increased expansion, but also the end of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. During the following few hundred years, the rise of the Ottoman Empire brought a larger Islamic presence to southeastern Europe, and the Safavids came to power in Iran. The land once called Persia became known as Iran during the Abbasid era, although foreigners still commonly referred to it as Persia until the 20th century. Steady Islamic trade in the Indian Ocean also expanded Islam into Southeast Asia. By 1500, the Islamic world was geographically expansive and politically, ethnically, and linguistically very diverse. Politics and religion in the Ummah. In the 16th century, the Ummah was composed of a number of large and small Islamic empires and states. Among the large empires were the Mughal Empire of India, discussed in India and International Connections, the Safavid Empire of Iran, and the Ottoman Empire of the Mediterranean. There were many more small kingdoms in places like Morocco, Indonesia, the Swahili coast, and parts of Central Asia. However, despite this political fragmentation, the various parts of the larger Islamic world maintained an element of cohesiveness derived largely from their religion. Rival Islamic kingdoms might disagree with each other on issues of official doctrine or politics, but members of the ulama, a class of religious clerics and scholars who act as the primary interpreters of Islamic law, engaged in scholarly debates and collaborated with each other through correspondence. Shared basic beliefs and a reverence for the teachings of Muhammad united all Muslims. Religious and political institutions tended to maintain a similar structure and function in different locations. Judges oversaw legal and religious disputes, and the ulama advised political rulers and ordinary citizens alike on policy by issuing non-binding legal opinions called fatwas. In this way, the ulama helped unify the increasingly diverse Islamic world. Also helping to expand and unify Islam were communities of Islamic mystics called Sufis. Like mystics in other religions, Sufis engaged in ascetic practices, meditation, and ritual prayer in order to have a personal experience with God and directly gain access to divine love and wisdom. Often they used music, poetry, and dancing to transcend their connection to the world and enter a trance-like state in which they could experience the divine presence. Sufism began in the 7th century, during the Umayyad Caliphate. By the 16th century, Sufi orders had been established throughout the Islamic world. These orders, often described as brotherhoods, even though some admitted women, formed around a leader who also served as the group's religious teacher. Sufis who achieved a special closeness with God were revered as saints, and their graves became sites of pilgrimage. Because Sufi practices often attracted the attention of ordinary people for whom complex theological treatises and abstruse legal debates held little interest, Sufis helped introduce Islam to places as far-flung as North and West Africa, Central Asia, and India, and served as missionaries of the expanding religion. Through a combination of imperial conquest, trade, Sufi missionary work, and migration, by 1500, the religion of Islam had expanded far and wide. As Muslims migrated to other lands, they usually established familiar Islamic religious institutions in their new communities. This provided a level of consistency for local people as well as for travelers, traders, and visitors. It also facilitated movement and exchange within the Islamic world and helped to unify Muslims as individual polities rose, fell, and were replaced. The result was a great geographic and ethnic diversity of the faith, and in places like India and Indonesia, new converts blended Islamic practices with indigenous traditions, figure 4:4. Throughout the Islamic world, Arabic script was also adapted to write the local languages, such as Kurdish, Pashto, Urdu, and Punjabi. An image of two buildings is shown. The building on the left is a square, tall tower made from red brick, with a clock near the top. There are minimal decorative carvings on the front and circular and square decorations along the bottom. The building on the right has a large, silver dome with a short spire and two smaller domes striped and decorated towers at the front. Green scallop trim runs along the edges of the roof, and pointed windows run along the bottom of the building. Figure 4:4 blended architecture. Islamic architecture in Southeast Asia blended earlier religious architectural traditions with those of Islam. For example, at the Menara Kudus Mosque in Java, the red brick of this minaret, the tower from which the call to prayer is made, reflects the local Hindu-Buddhist architectural style. Credit Masjid Menara Kudus by PL09 Wikimedia Commons, CC010. Not everyone exposed to Islam or incorporated into the Islamic world adopted Islam. Many Christians in southeastern Europe and southwest Asia continued to practice their religion within the larger Islamic environment. The expansion of Islam into India occasionally invigorated Hinduism and other religions there. While allowed to practice their religions, people in these non-Muslim communities granted protection by Muslim rulers, called dhimmis, were required to acknowledge the sovereignty of Muslim leadership. The dhimmi system was intended to provide religious minorities with official standing within the Muslim community and grant them legal protection, but it usually also included some restrictions on their public lives, such as their clothing choices, and it limited the jobs they could hold and thus their social mobility. The most common hardship was the jizya, or poll tax, figure 4:5. A brown fragment of a ripped and aged thin piece of paper with rows of writing in Muslim script is shown. There is a purple oval stamp with letters on the edges in the bottom right corner of the paper. Figure 4:5, a Muslim tax receipt. This receipt, issued in 1615, confirms that the inhabitants of an Ottoman village in Bulgaria have paid the jizya tax. Credit Jizya document Chakmanovo 1615 by unknown / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Life was often harder for dhimmis than for Muslims of the same social class, and non-Muslims in many places converted to improve their social standing and chances for upward mobility. Merchants often converted to Islam to gain access to Islamic trading networks and potential business partners. Non-Muslim men seeking to marry Muslim women, whether for love or to gain connections to a prominent family, were required to convert. Christian and Jewish women could marry Muslim men without converting, but a Muslim woman could marry only a Muslim man. Islamic trade networks. Islam had arisen in a region defined by trade and travel. Many prominent early Muslims, including Muhammad himself, were traders or members of trading families. And thanks to the institutional continuity specified under Sharia, Islamic religious law, trade soon became closely regulated. The taxes levied on imported goods were systematized, and markets were inspected and administered in the same way throughout the Islamic world. By the 16th century, the flags of Islam flew from Spain and Morocco in the west to the gates of China in the east. However, these territories were not unified under one political leader. Instead, what brought them together into one collective ummah, despite their political, ethnic, and linguistic differences, was a network based on trade and travel, which carried Islam farther than its armies ever could. Trade routes crisscrossed the larger Islamic world, connecting far-flung regions. By sea, Muslim merchants traded from India and Southeast Asia, especially the country of Indonesia, to East Africa, Egypt, and the Arabian Peninsula. Muslims in Central Asia and China traded overland with merchants in Iran, East and North Africa, and the Balkans. Caravans crossing the Sahara extended trade into West Africa. Along these trade routes traveled merchants, missionaries, scholars, and many others. Their movement facilitated not only the expansion of Islam, but also the spread of languages like Arabic and Persian, which became the languages of commerce, scholarship, and literary expression. It also allowed for the flow and exchange of new technologies, ideas, precious metals, writing and numerical systems, and a great variety of agricultural products once available only in small corners of the world. Figure 4. 6. A map of southern Europe, most of the African continent, Arabia, Iran, India, China, Java, and the Indian Ocean is shown. Maritime routes are shown with a purple line traveling through waterways between Java and the Indian Ocean, up to stops along the coasts of China, India, Iran, Arabia, and Somalia in eastern Africa, and going up the Suez Canal as well. Land routes shown with orange lines are shown going between land in China, India, Iran, northern Arabia, and crisscrossing most of northern Africa down to Somalia in the eastern portion of Africa. Figure 4. 6. Muslim trade routes. Muslim merchants conducted trade over a vast territory, dominating land routes in Central Asia, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. Sailors from India, Yemen, and Iran participated in a thriving Indian Ocean trade. Credit, modification of work, World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Dhimmi and other non-Muslim populations were frequently encouraged to participate in trade because of their specializations and contacts in distant areas. Armenian Christians, for example, were heavily involved in the silk trade, and their presence was welcomed in major trade centers. Jewish communities were linked by a trade network they had established between Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Being exempt from the financial provisions of Sharia, which forbade charging interest on loans, Jewish people rose to prominence as moneylenders and bankers, usually serving both Muslim and Christian clients. Jewish law forbade them to loan money at interest to other Jewish people, and Muslims traveled and traded widely, guided by Muhammad's often cited hadith, or saying, "Seek knowledge, even unto China." Islamic communities sprang up along the Silk Roads, the land routes between the Middle East and China, and in other places where Muslim merchants traveled, such as East Africa, West Africa, and India. When merchants established themselves in non-Muslim communities, they often intermarried with the local population, and the children resulting from these marriages were usually raised as Muslims. Members of the existing merchant community often converted to Islam to forge closer relationships with Muslim traders. Once a Muslim community had been established, religious scholars often followed to found mosques, schools, and charitable organizations. In this way, Islam spread throughout Asia, Africa, and the Balkans. When merchants arrived in a new city, they usually selected a prayer leader, often a member of the ulama who also served as a judge. A Muslim market inspector vouched for the accuracy of weights and measures, verified business contracts between Muslim merchants, certified the sizes of loads being shipped out, and ensured that businesses adhered to Sharia. The consistency with which Muslim merchants and traders operated was a key advantage of contracting with them to transport goods long distances. Another benefit was the widespread use of letters of credit, which were recognized in other Islamic lands and allowed merchants to travel without carrying large amounts of gold. Trade earned profits for participating states in two ways. The first was by bringing in direct income from importing and selling goods, including spices, ivory, salt, silks, and other luxury items, as well as enslaved people. Given their central location at the crossroads of Europe, Africa, and Asia, Muslim merchants frequently acted as intermediaries who purchased goods from one area and sold them to merchants from another. The second financial benefit of trade was the receipt of taxes that states levied on goods being transported through their territory. Given the profit potential of the goods traded, robbers and bandits were a constant threat. Governments thus sponsored inns called caravansaries at regular intervals on major trade routes, usually one day's journey apart, where traders could rest and store their goods securely. Figure 47. Wealthy individuals might also build caravansaries, providing shelter for travelers as an act of piety. Weak states that could not guarantee security for traders and travelers often found trade routes shifting out of their territory if they became too risky. A picture of a large, open, square fortress-like structure is shown in the middle of a barren desert. The front shows a tall, open, rectangular entrance with smaller, ornately carved doors to either side. Another ornate doorway in a wall is shown running down the middle of the structure. The back wall shows another tall open doorway with three smaller doorways on either side. Most of the structure is open with only the four corners showing clay roofs in irregular dimensions. Two cloaked people are shown walking into the main doorway. A small square metal building is located in the front left of the picture, and a car is shown parked in the forefront. One road is shown in the right of the picture leading into the background. Figure 4. 7. A medieval caravansary. This caravansary in Iran was built in the 12th century and served as a fortified place for travelers to rest. Caravansaries were usually located far from urban centers in areas that were, and still are, quite remote. Credit: Modification of work Ribati Sharaf or Robati Sharaf by Rizamash/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. The influence of caravansaries on trade and images of architectural elements of caravansaries and floor plans are available. Some caravansaries are still in existence. Check out caravansaries of the Silk Road and caravansaries in Turkey to learn more. In addition to the shipment of material goods like agricultural products, precious metals, and spices, the transportation of enslaved people was also facilitated along Islamic trading routes. Since Sharia forbids Muslims from enslaving other Muslims, it became common practice to enslave non-Muslims from regions within reach of Islamic slavers. Common sources included North and Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, India, and Indonesia. Enslaved people being moved around the Islamic world were traded for a great variety of goods like cloth, pottery, glassware, and precious metals. Muslim traders also acted as intermediaries, passing enslaved people from Africa to merchants in Central Asia and Europe, and they were the primary traders engaged in transporting enslaved people across the Sahara Desert. Figure 4. 8. A drawing of a straw-roofed hut is shown. There are two tiers. At the top, open tier, three black bearded men kneel in gold-trimmed colorful turbans and draped clothing. The man on the left is pointing with his hands, while the man in the middle is holding a scale and looking at the man at the right, who is looking back at him and pointing to a flat basket below the scale. On the lower tier, people are shown in front of a wall of the hut. In the left corner of the drawing, a man with a white cloth covering his face, dressed in a blue long shirt with a gold-trimmed red cape, is shown pushing away a shorter person next to him in a green long dress and white turban. They have long black hair and have a scared expression on their face. In the bottom middle, three African people sit on the stone road dressed in white cloths, with some colorful shirts and pants peeking through. They are motioning with their hands. A pale-skinned man is behind the African person on the right, wearing a yellow shirt and a white cloth on his head. In the right corner of the drawing, there is a black-bearded man in a long blue shirt, gold-trimmed red cape, gesturing with his hands. He wears an ornate turban on his head. Arabic text runs along the top and bottom of the drawing. Figure 4. 8. A slave market. This page from the Maqamat al-Hariri, a 13th-century manuscript illustrated by Yahya ibn Mahmud al-Wasiti, depicts the Zabid slave market in Yemen. Credit: Slave Zadib Yemen 13th century by Bibliothèque Nationale de France / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Within the Islamic world, women outnumbered men among the enslaved 2 to 1. Men were primarily employed in domestic work or service within the estates of the rich, laboring on irrigation projects and in mines or taking care of animals. Most women were kept in wealthy households, where they became domestic servants such as nursemaids, or were kept for sexual purposes. Although enslaved people did have legal recourse if mistreated or abused, it was difficult for them to access the courts without the aid of a sympathetic free person. There was no social stigma to prevent a slave owner from recognizing his children with an enslaved woman. The children were born free, and the mother gained her freedom upon the death of her owner. Mohammed encouraged the freeing of enslaved people, and many Muslims did so. Enslaved men and women were also allowed to purchase their own freedom. This, together with the fact that the children of enslaved women and their owners were born free, meant that it was difficult to maintain a permanently enslaved population in the Islamic world, or to make the enslaved population self-reproducing. Those who sought to use enslaved workers thus frequently needed to replenish their labor force by making new purchases, ensuring that the trade in enslaved people remained important in the Islamic world until the 19th century. Technology in the Islamic world. Despite the absence of centralized political authority, communication across long distances was possible in the Islamic world because Arabic, the language of the Quran, also served for most scholarly and administrative purposes as well as religious ones. Scholars were widely scattered, but rarely were they isolated, and most traders carried letters across long distances as part of their cargo. Scientists were thus able to compare their observations. Students learned from advisors and mentors in far-off lands, and members of the ulama sought counsel from colleagues they might never meet. Because of the dominance of trade and travel in the Islamic world, scientific and technological innovations that supported these endeavors were especially prized. Map-making, for example, was particularly valued. Maps were created by geographers who collected information about the known world through either their own observations or knowledge disseminated by others. For example, in 1513, the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis completed a map of the known world. Figure 4. 9. To do so, he relied on observations made by Christopher Columbus, Portuguese explorers in India, and several Arab sources. Unfortunately, only about one-third of his map has survived. A rectangular fragment of a map is shown with torn, worn edges and stains. The Atlantic Ocean, Europe, Africa, and Brazil are shown. Images of ships appear in the waters. On land, images of animals, people, terrain, and buildings are shown. Script appears along the left edge of the map. Lines are drawn throughout the map leading to and from circles on the map. Figure 4-9 Piri rises map of the world. The only remaining portion of the world map created in 1513 by the Ottoman cartographer Piri, Rise shows the Atlantic Ocean bordered by Europe, Africa, and Brazil. Credit: Map of the World by Ottoman Admiral Piri Rise, drawn in 1513 by Library of Topkapi Palace Museum/Wikipedia, public domain. One of the travelers who produced a wealth of geographic information for Islamic mapmakers was Ibn Battuta, a 14th-century Moroccan reputed to have traveled more than 73,000 miles during his lifetime. He initially journeyed to Mecca to perform the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, but then decided to continue exploring north and east of Arabia instead of going home. He eventually made his way to China, returning via East Africa and crossing the Sahara to Mali as an envoy of the King of Morocco. Toward the end of his life, Ibn Battuta dictated his memoirs of his travels, which not only were important for mapmakers of his time, but also remain a valuable primary source for historians today. Other travelers also produced Hajj narratives that pilgrims often used as guides to the lands they passed through. Beyond developing devices useful for trade and travel, Islamic innovators also devised systems for using location and compass headings to calculate the Qibla, the direction toward Mecca that Muslims must face while praying. Early methods relied on crude directions. Mecca is east. But by the 9th century, mathematical calculations were being used. By the 14th century, mathematics had progressed to the degree that Shams al-Din al-Khalili, the official timekeeper of Damascus, applied advanced trigonometry to calculate the Qibla for a range of locations with such precision that today's satellite technology is barely able to improve on it. These and other efforts to fix a person's location on the globe led to advancements in astronomical measurements, as did the need to calculate prayer times each day based on the sun's position in the sky. Military technology, especially the use of gunpowder, also greatly advanced in this period. Originally developed in China, gunpowder was transmitted to the Islamic world in the 13th and 14th centuries, possibly first introduced by the Mongols. By the 15th century, the Janissary Corps of the Ottoman Empire were using firearms like the arquebus, an early long gun, in battle. And it was the Ottomans who famously used artillery in the siege of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottoman Empire was not the only Islamic state to use and improve upon gunpowder arms. Both the Safavids in Iran and the Mughals in India were famous for their ability to arm their soldiers with firearms like the powerful matchlock rifle, figure 4.10. A man with a black mustache wears a long blue belted shirt with 2 slits along the bottom, red pants, and ornate blue and orange slippers. On his head, he wears an orange hat with a white cloth tied around it. He holds a blue and orange rifle over his left shoulder with his left arm, and is putting something on a string toward his mouth with his right. His belt holds many colorful, hanging objects as well as a long orange scarf. Figure 4.10. The matchlock rifle. The matchlock, shown here in the arms of a Mughal officer in the 16th century, was a powerful and portable firearm used by Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal armies. Credit: Officer of the Mughal Army, c. 1585 Color Litho, by the Bridgman Art Library / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1974, historians Marshall G. S. Hodgson and William H. McNeill theorized that the adoption of gunpowder technology was what led to the rise of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal realms, coining the term gunpowder empires as a description of them. Today that theory is largely disputed, but the name has remained. What these empires had in common was their conception of the entire state as a military force, in which all political, economic, and cultural resources were coordinated by the central government to strengthen the army and maintain internal and external security. Their view of the state and their ability to consolidate resources in order to pay for technological advances also enabled these three empires to research, develop, and deploy new military technologies, including firearms and cannon, much more quickly than their enemies did. For more than 2 centuries, they were among the strongest and most stable economies in the world, and their patronage of art and culture produced works of visual art, architecture, and literature that are still considered among the best ever produced. Collectively, the so-called gunpowder empires earned the awe, envy, respect, and fear of their contemporaries in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Dueling voices. Perspectives on trade in the Muslim world. An emphasis on how Muslims should conduct business affairs is found in some of the hadith or sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, himself a trader. Sunni Muslims consider hadiths collected by al-Bukhari, Abu Dawud, and Ibn Majah among the most authentic guides to behavior. Shiites place more faith in stories narrated by Muhammad's daughter Fatima and her husband, Muhammad's cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib, whom they recognize as the Prophet's direct successor as leader of the Muslim community. There will be 3 types of people whom Allah will neither speak to them on the day of resurrection, nor will purify them from sins, and they will have a painful punishment. They are 1. A man who possesses superfluous water along the road who withholds it from travelers. 3. A man who sells something to another man, and swears a false oath that he has been offered so much for it whereupon the buyer believes him and buys it although in fact, the seller has not been offered such a price. Sahih al-Bukhari 72:12. Hakim asked Muhammad, "A man comes to me and wants me to sell him something which is not in my possession. Should I buy it for him from the market?" Muhammad replied, "Do not sell what you do not possess." Sunan Abi Dawud 35:03. Transactions may only be done by mutual consent. Ibn Majah Vol. 3, Book 12, Hadith 2185. Almost a millennium later, the philosopher and historian Ibn Khaldun wrote about the importance of governments allowing trade. As we have stated, the dynasty is the greatest market, the mother and base of all trade. It is the market that provides the substance of income and expenditures for trade. If government business slumps and the volume of trade is small, the dependent markets will naturally show the same symptoms, and to a greater degree. Furthermore, money circulates between subjects and ruler, moving back and forth. Now if the ruler keeps it to himself, it is lost to the subjects. This is how God proceeds with his servants. Muqaddimah, chapter 3, section 40. According to the Hadith, what are some of the ethical standards that should govern business? Why do you think these were made part of religious law? According to Ibn Khaldun, why is allowing trade important for a government? What would happen if governments restricted it? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to analyze the significance of the reign of Sulayman the Magnificent, including the rise of the Sultanate of Women. Describe the relationship between the Ottoman Empire and the nations of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Identify scientific and technological innovations of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the foremost and longest-lived of the Islamic empires of the early modern world. It was formed by a small group of Turkic-speaking warriors assisted by Anatolian and Balkan Christian warlords and their followers at the end of the 13th century. For nearly 700 years, the Ottoman state lay at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, ruling over a population diverse in ethnicity, language, and religion. In 1453, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople. A century later, the city, then called Istanbul, was one of the largest in the world, occupying a prize position on the Bosporus, the sea passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and facilitating trade between the Silk Roads and Europe. At its height under Sultan Sulayman I in the 16th century, the Ottoman military was the most technologically advanced in the Mediterranean world, threatening the gates of Vienna to the west, reaching the Persian Gulf to the east, and conquering Yemen and the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina to the south. Figure 4. 11. In the 17th century, as its enemies grew stronger, the empire became more inward-looking, focusing less on external expansion and more on resolving domestic affairs, professionalizing its bureaucracy, and conducting internal reforms. A map showing parts of southern Europe, northeastern Africa, and southwestern Asia is shown. The cities of Genoa, Venice, Rome, and Naples are labeled in Italy. A highlighted area stretches from the cities of Buda and Pest in Europe, down through Belgrade, circling the Black Sea in a thin strip in the north, through Constantinople and Trebizond extending to the Caspian Sea. The area extends south to Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem. A small strip branches to the east through the city of Basra and south along the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf. At Jerusalem, the highlighted area heads south to Suez along the eastern border of the Red Sea down through Medina, Jeddah, Mecca, and extending to the tip of Arabia. From Suez, the area extends west into the northern portion of Africa through Alexandria and south toward Lake Nasser, Tripoli, and an oval area south, Tunis and Algiers. Figure 4:11 Area of Ottoman control. At its height, the Ottoman Empire Orange stretched from the Balkans to the Caspian Sea. It also laid claim to the coast of North Africa, Egypt, and portions of the Arabian Peninsula. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Culture and Society. The Ottoman state originated in the fertile plains of Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, roughly modern-day Turkey, which lies between the Aegean Sea to its west, the Black Sea to its north, the Mediterranean Sea to its south, and the Zagros Mountains to its east. The lands of Anatolia were attractive to the nomadic Turkic peoples who lived in the semi-fertile Eurasian steppe, a band of grassland that runs from east to west between western China and Hungary. As the Turkic peoples extended their control over northern Iran in the 10th and 11th centuries, a group of Turkic warriors established their own state, ruled by the Seljuk dynasty. Over the next century and a half, this Seljuk state grew to control much of central and southern Anatolia. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century transformed the political landscape in Anatolia, however, and a number of small Turkic principalities emerged in the region in the wake of these disruptive invasions. The Turkic principality in the northeastern corner of Anatolia rose to prominence around 1300, under the leadership of Osman, I figure 412. Osman raised an army and began to take territory from the neighboring Byzantines. A painting of a man with a black beard seated on a throne in the middle of a courtyard with a blue floor is shown. He wears blue and black long robes with gold stripes on his chest. On his head is a white turban with red adornments at the top. A dark black panther-like animal is walking toward him, while a rectangular pool is located in the middle, with a zigzag drain running from it to the bottom of the painting. To the left of the throne, 3 men stand huddled close together, each dressed in colorful long robes and gold-adorned long domed hats. Each holds a long object. To the left stands a man with a long black beard, wearing long blue and red robes adorned with gold stripes on his chest, wearing a white and red turban on his head. To the right of the man on the throne stand 2 men apart from each other, with black beards, ornate and colorful robes, and white and red turbans on their heads. In the bottom right of the painting stand 2 men very close together in green and red robes, with black mustaches, and white dimed hats on their heads. Along the bottom of the painting, 2 men's heads are shown with white and red domed hats. Trees and pink and white flowers are visible in the background behind a red and purple wall. Text runs across the top of the painting. Figure 4. 12 Osman I. This detail of a miniature painted in 1584 shows Osman I seated at center amid courtiers and attendants. Credit: Modification of work Osman Ghazi I by Sayed Lockman / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Osman's son, Orhan, continued the campaign upon his father's death, expanding the territory under his control to encompass much of northwestern Anatolia. The state Orhan established became the Ottoman Empire, named for his father Osman. By the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire had expanded into southeastern Europe, effectively surrounding the Byzantine city of Constantinople. In 1453, Ottoman armies marched into the city and made it the capital of their expanding realm. Over the next century, successive rulers expanded the empire deeper into Europe, down through Syria and Palestine, and across North Africa. At the height of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, the Muslim-controlled state exerted dominance over a vast expanse of territory that included not only Muslims, but also many dhimmis, Christians, Jewish people, and others. For example, the Ottoman-controlled areas of the Balkans in southeastern Europe were not only much more densely populated than Anatolia, but were also overwhelmingly Christian. The Christian populations in southeastern Europe were some of the oldest in the Christian world and unlikely to convert to Islam in any large numbers. This reality led the Ottomans to implement a system under which dhimmis were able to govern their own affairs according to their own religious laws. This became known as the millet system, a term that comes from the Arabic word millah, meaning nation. Millets were organized around religious identity. Orthodox Christians comprised one millet under the Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul, Armenian Christians were a second, and Jewish people a third. Other groups, such as the Syriac-speaking Christians and the Coptic Christians of Egypt, were later given their own millets. Millets had their own courts to settle their affairs. A dhimmi would appear in a Sharia court only if dealing with a Muslim in a legal or business matter, or with the state itself. The millet system was intended to give non-Muslims a degree of autonomy and the ability to conduct their affairs according to their own customs and norms. Among the most striking measures imposed on Christian communities in the Balkans and Caucasus was the devshirme, gathering, the enslavement of youth for state and military service. Conceived as a form of taxation on the Christian territories of Ottoman-controlled Europe, this system gathered boys between 8 and 10 years of age from specified villages, converted them to Islam, and gave them an education designed to create an elite military force in the service of the Sultan. They were selected for both their physical attributes and their intelligence. The training was harsh and emphasized discipline, endurance, and loyalty to the Sultan. Most became part of an elite corps of soldiers known as the Janissaries, from the Turkish words Yenişehri, meaning new soldier. Janissaries were expected to serve as bodyguards to the Sultan, to whom they were fiercely loyal and who paid them directly. A small number of young men who demonstrated exceptional intellect were sent to the palace school to receive language and other training in preparation for becoming the empire's trusted administrative elite. The idea was to create a self-perpetuating system of administrators and military leaders who had been raised by the Ottoman state, and whose loyalty was not to their families, whom, in theory, they never saw again, but to the Sultan and the system of which they were a part. In this way, political infighting within the government could be avoided because personal identity, ethnicity, and religion were suppressed, and nepotism eliminated. The devshirme system lasted until the late 1600s. The Ottomans brought knowledge of horses, military organization, and statecraft to their early empire. They followed their Seljuk predecessors in holding Persian culture and style in high esteem. While Arabic was considered the language of learning and religion, Persian was often the language of poetry and literature, even in the otherwise Arabic-speaking court of the Abbasid caliphs. The Ottoman Empire is often described as Persianate, meaning its culture, including visual art and architecture, was heavily influenced by that of Persia, but it was not Persian itself. Figure 413. Turkish was the language of administration and education. It was written in an adapted version of the Perso-Arabic script, and it incorporated numerous loanwords from both Persian and Arabic. A parallel tradition of high poetry in Turkish called divan poetry also developed, which used the rhyme schemes and poetic meters of Persian poetry. In the 17th century, during the long conflict between the Ottomans and the Safavids in Iran, Turkish replaced Persian as a literary language to emphasize the Turkish nature of the Ottoman state and distinguish its culture from that of its rival. A very colorful image shows a blue mountain with a tree at the top. From the tree, going down the mountain in a zigzag, runs a brown path with stones and grasses lining the edges. Behind the mountain on the left, 6 men ride horses of various colors. The men wear very colorful coats, with 5 wearing brown hats and 1 with a brown helmet. They carry 4 solid flags of orange, green, red, and white. To the right behind the mountain, 5 men in colorful coats and white hats ride on different colored horses and carry 5 small, triangular brown flags. In the middle of the painting, 3 men in colorful long coats and ornate hats are shown riding horses across the blue mountain, while 6 men in long ornate coats, white pants, and very tall green and white hats with birds on them are walking in front of them. The bottom of the painting, at the lower portion of the blue mountain, shows a brown hilly section. Behind this hill, 4 men in ornately colorful coats and turbans and helmets ride horses, while 1 man in a plain orange coat and white hat rides a horse with another riderless horse next to him. In front of the brown hill along the bottom left of the painting, 2 men in very colorful long coats and white hats ride horses while looking at each other. In the right corner, 2 men with black spotted white long coats and red pants with hats with birds on them are pictured. One rides a horse while the other man walks next to him. Most men in the painting carry weapons, but a few are unarmed. Text appears in the bottom left and top right part of the painting. Figure 413. The Suleiman name. Persian literary and artistic styles greatly influenced the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. This illustration, made in the style of a Persian miniature, is part of the Suleiman name, the Book of Suleiman, created at the court of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1561. It includes verses written in Persian by the poet Fethullah Celebi. Credit: Suleiman name Nasivan by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Most people in the Ottoman Empire could not read or write. As in most of the early modern world, primary education was considered the domain of religious institutions, not the state, although schools were often endowed by members of the Sultan's family. Basic schools called mektebs taught young Muslims to recite the Quran, and each millet was allowed to coordinate education for its own children. Schools tended to provide education in the preferred local language, since Turkish was required only of those who interacted directly with the state. This is one of the main reasons that Turkish did not eventually replace local languages like Arabic, Bulgarian, Greek, and Serbo-Croatian Bosnian, although in some places people who were not ethnically Turkish did speak only Turkish. Local languages like Bosnian also incorporated many loan words from Ottoman Turkish. Multilingualism was valued for trade and commerce, and let European traders communicate easily with local agents and business partners. It also allowed new immigrant groups to retain their languages. For example, after Jewish people were expelled from Spain in 1492, many resettled in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in Izmir, Salonika, and Istanbul, where they continued to speak Judeo-Spanish, often called Ladino. Education past the basic primary level was generally accessible mainly to the wealthy. Some boys from average and poor families managed to attend local schools, but most people needed their children to help with agricultural work or assist in their father's business. Boys from elite families went to private schools, and girls from similar families were educated at home by a private tutor. This was also the case among the millets. Millets provided schools for members of their community. A private school for Greek Christians opened in Istanbul in 1454, for example. The further education of exceptionally bright children from the lower classes might be sponsored by a wealthy local patron or landowner, often with the condition that the children go to work for the patron's business after finishing school. Following the construction of a lavish palace complex in Istanbul in the early 1460s, important changes took place in the royal court and the Ottoman style of government. Over the next century, successive Ottoman sultans ruled less frequently from constantly moving military encampments, as had been their practice, and took up longer periods of residence at the new palace, later given the name Topkapi. One result of this change to a more stable home was the re-entry of women into the public and political life of the Ottoman court, which had once been more usual in the Seljuk state. After Sultan Bayezid I's wife had been captured and held hostage by the Mongol conqueror Timur in the 1400s, it became the practice for sultans not to marry, but to simply take concubines, women who did not have the same legal status as an official wife, and whose chief purpose was to bear children for the sultan. Suleiman I defied this tradition to marry Hurrem, a young woman from Ruthenia, now western Ukraine, who had been captured and enslaved by Crimean Tatars. While a captive, Hurrem was eventually taken to Istanbul and purchased by Suleiman's mother as a gift for her son. As Hurrem's sultan, she became one of the most important and influential women in Ottoman history, setting a precedent for the powerful wives and chief concubines who followed her in what became known as the Sultanate of Women, figure 4. 14. Part A is a painting of a woman. She wears a red, long, velvety coat with round buttons over a white-trimmed blouse. On her head, she wears a very tall headdress with gold dacre and a medallion and pearl, a veil coming off of the back. She has earrings and a ring on the third finger of her left hand. She holds a long, thin stick in her right hand. The words ROSASOLYMANNIVXOR appear in the upper left corner of the image. Part B is an illustration of a man wearing a tall, tiered hat with a feather coming out of the top. The hat resembles armor and is intricately decorated. Figure 4. 14. Hurrem Sultan. This 16th century oil painting of Hurrem Sultan A, who was known as Roxolana in Europe, identifies her with the Latin words for Suleiman's wife. In this mid-16th century woodcut B, Sultan Suleiman wears a four-tiered helmet encrusted with diamonds and pearls. The design was modeled on the three-tiered tiara of the Pope. Credit, a modification of work Portrait of Roxolana, Cowram by Jack Amron Collection, Istanbul/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of work, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent wearing the jewel-studded helmet, by Harris Brisbane Dick Fund, 1942, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Public domain. The wife or mother of the reigning sultan had unequaled power over the imperial family, and frequently gained popularity by funding public monuments and buildings for use by the public, including soup kitchens, bathhouses, fountains, and schools. Many of these were vakfs, charitable endowments intended to help the poor or to serve religious purposes. Wealthy women and men as well often donated land or buildings along with funds to assist the public. Outsiders who sought favor often wrote letters to or sent female relatives to plead their case with the sultan's wife or mother. She in turn might transform her popular influence into political power by conspiring with palace administrators like the palace's chief eunuch, becoming one of the most powerful people in the empire. The chief wife and the sultan's mother were often rivals for political prominence. Clashes could occur between them, and also with the sultan's chief, male, advisors at court. The Sultanate of Women lasted more than a century, ending in the late 17th century when a number of sultans died unexpectedly in a short period. The result was instability in the palace, and a weakening of the interpersonal relationships between the imperial family and outside advisors upon whom the Sultanate of Women had relied. In their own words, a visit to Hurrem Sultan by a Genoese noblewoman. During the reign of Sultan Suleiman, high-ranking delegations were often sent between Istanbul and its trading partners in Genoa and Venice. It then became customary for the chief delegate's wife to visit Hurrem Sultan in the harem. One of them later described the event as follows: "I was received by many eunuchs in splendid costume blazing with jewels and carrying scimitars in their hands. They led me to an inner vestibule where I was divested of my cloak and shoes and regaled with refreshments. Presently an elderly woman, very richly dressed, accompanied by a number of young girls, approached me, and after the usual salutation, informed me that the Sultana Aseki, the Sultan's chief wife, was ready to see me. All the walls of the kiosk in which she lives are covered with the most beautiful Persian tiles, and the floors are of cedar and sandalwood, which give out the most delicious odor. I advanced through an endless row of bending female slaves who stood on either side of my path. The Sultana, who is a stout but beautiful young woman, sat upon silk cushions striped with silver, near a latticed window overlooking the sea. Numerous slave women, blazing with jewels, attended upon her, holding fans, pipes for smoking, and many objects of value. When we had selected from these, the great lady, who rose to receive me, extended her hand and kissed me on the brow and made me sit at the edge of the divan on which she reclined. She asked many questions concerning our country and our religion, of which she knew nothing whatever, and which I answered as modestly and discreetly as I could. I was surprised to notice, when I had finished my narrative, that the room was full of women who, impelled by curiosity, had come to see me and to hear what I had to say. The Sultana now entertained me with an exhibition of dancing girls and music, which was very delectable. When the dancing and music were over, refreshments were served upon trays of solid gold sparkling with jewels. As it was growing late and I felt afraid to remain longer, lest I should vex her, I made a motion of rising to leave. She immediately clapped her hands, and several slaves came forward, in obedience to her whispered commands, carrying trays heaped up with beautiful stuffs, and some silver articles of fine workmanship, which she pressed me to accept. I was led from the room in precisely the same manner in which I had entered it, down to the foot of the staircase, where my own attendants awaited me. Eva March Tappan, The World's Story. A history of the world in story, song, and art. How does the narrator describe her visit to the harem? Does she seem impressed? What kinds of details are important to her? How are Hurrem Sultan's power and position reflected in the way people behave toward her and around her? Other than the Sultan's mother or wife, women in the Ottoman Empire played no role in politics. They were active in other areas of life, however. Unlike European women before the 19th century, married and unmarried Ottoman women could buy, inherit, and own property and bequeath their wealth to others upon their death. They could borrow and lend money and sue to protect their rights in court. Marriages were usually arranged by parents, but at least in theory, women had to consent to the match and could later obtain a divorce. Elite and middle-class women's time was occupied in raising their children and supervising their households. If they lived in towns or cities, they socialized with other women, often meeting them at bathhouses. On their rare ventures out in public, they wore veils as a sign of their status. Women from the working class might manufacture goods in their homes and peddle them in the streets. Although they could invest in businesses, they were largely excluded from the official guild system, which admitted only male artisans. There were a number of female-dominated trades, however, such as nursing and dancing, and women often made a living doing laundry. They also belonged to the various Sufi orders. Of course, the lives of both Muslim and non-Muslim women differed depending on where in the Ottoman Empire they lived. The lives of peasant women were different from those of city dwellers, and besides caring for the home and children, They might assist their male relatives with chores on the farm. The synthesis of the Ottoman Empire's diverse cultural base is perhaps most evident in its cuisine, which incorporated cooking styles and ingredients from places all over the world including Greece, Iran, the Balkans, the Arabian Peninsula, and Central Asia. Following the discovery of the Americas, Ottoman cooks were among the first to incorporate ingredients from there, such as maize, peppers, tomatoes, and pumpkins, into their dishes. The Ottomans also likely introduced foods from elsewhere in Asia, like sesame, into the kitchens of the Middle East. Many dishes, such as rice pilafs from Egypt, Iran, and Central Asia, and Indian tandoori casseroles, were elegantly recreated for the imperial court in the kitchens of Topkapi Palace, and then adopted in less extravagant versions by people throughout the empire. Food was an important symbol of power and generosity, and Topkapi could host up to 4,000 people for a banquet. Each year, the Sultan provided a lavish feast for the Janissary Corps, the Ottoman Empire's most elite troops. At one point in the 18th century, 10,000 troops were fed at once, figure 415. A painting is shown of large group of men on the left side in rows, on a yellow background, moving toward the right side of the painting. The men wear long coats over their long shirts in various colors of yellow, white, pink, green, blue, and red. They all wear belts and red slippers. Their white hats are decorated with green or yellow accents. On the right side of the painting are yellow circles in 3 vertical columns with white and yellow oval coloring on them. One man is shown losing his hat as he falls. One man stoops as if to pick up one of the discs. Figure 4. 15. The Janissaries Banquet. A miniature painting from 1720 by the artist Abdülselah Levni, contained in Surname I Veybi, the Book of Festival, depicts the Janissaries rushing toward their plates at a banquet given by the Sultan. Credit, Banquet Safranpilla for the Janissaries, given by the Sultan by Badish's Landis Museum /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The birth of an heir, a royal wedding, and the funeral of the Sultan, or his wife or mother, were all occasions upon which the palace was expected to hold public banquets. Soup kitchens fed thousands of people each day in major cities throughout the empire, as did the caravansaries. At the same time, public refusal to partake of the Sultan's food also conveyed a powerful message. When upset with imperial policies, the Janissaries symbolically turned their metal soup bowls upside down and beat them like drums. The sound reverberated around the capital, signaling their displeasure for all to hear. The past meets the present. Cuisine at the Topkapi Palace. One item often found in contemporary Eastern Mediterranean cuisines is baklava, a confection of pastry layers and nuts drenched in syrup. Recipes in cookbooks from the Abbasid era use flatbread soaked in sugar syrup and tossed with toasted nuts. The kitchens at the Topkapi Palace introduced very thin layers of pastry called phyllo. Throughout the empire, wealthy estates replicated the technique. A woman who could produce phyllo thin enough to read through was a worthy bride. Today, cultures from Greece to Afghanistan argue over where baklava originated, which nuts to use, and whose method for producing phyllo is best. The palace cooks also elevated traditional methods from the steppes and flatlands of Central and West Asia, such as grilling small pieces of meat on skewers for a dish known as kebab. They experimented with different cuts and kinds of meat, richly spiced and served atop mountains of rice seasoned with saffron, still one of the world's most expensive spices. Today, shops selling kebabs are common in Europe and the Middle East, and shish, a Turkish word meaning skewer, kebabs are popular in the United States. Dumplings called manti, believed to have originated in Xinjiang among the Uyghurs, are found in variations from China to the Balkans. The Topkapi chefs learned to produce these dumplings, smaller than a teaspoon and delicately flavored. Recipes appeared in an English-language Ottoman cookbook in 1880. The Ottomans also used their location on the spice trading network to incorporate Asian spices into their cuisine. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of Britain's 18th-century ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, complained that the flavors were too intense. In a letter home, she reported commanding her chef to prepare blander dishes the English preferred. Today, the food of the Ottoman Empire is consumed around the world. Sherbet, originally a chilled Iranian drink, was introduced to Italy in the 17th century by way of the empire, and soon consumers in France and England were delighting in it as people do today. In the 20th century, yogurt from the Turkish to knead, or to be curdled, was first mass-produced in Western Europe by Isaac Carasso, an immigrant from the Ottoman Empire. Named for his son Daniel, it is sold in the United States as Dannon. How did Ottoman cuisine reflect the diversity of the empire's demographic and geographic makeup? How has Middle Eastern cuisine influenced the cuisines of Western Europe and of the United States? Coffee drinking occupied a position in Ottoman life that was on par with, indeed, perhaps more important than feasting, and the Ottomans first introduced it to Europe. The practice began in Arabia and spread to other places in the Islamic world. The first coffee houses were established in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, where they provided spaces for men to socialize, do business, and exchange news. Men of all social classes frequented coffee houses, and men of little education could listen to literate men reading aloud from books, hear poets recite their newest works, and watch scholars engage in debates. Political discussions were common, and the Ottoman government often sent spies to listen for signs of dissent or potential rebellion. Talk of politics was especially frequent at coffee houses favored by janissaries. While many Muslim clerics had no objection to coffee because it was not forbidden by Sharia, some clerics disapproved of it because of its stimulating qualities, and unsuccessful attempts to ban it were made in the 16th century. In the 17th century, Sultan Murad IV, fearful that rebellion might be plotted in coffee houses, banned them, and citizens who persisted in drinking coffee risked being sentenced to death. Many Muslim clerics and scholars also objected to the smoking of tobacco, which had been introduced from the Americas in the 16th century and become popular in the Ottoman Empire by the 17th century. They saw tobacco as an intoxicant that affected people in the way wine or coffee did, and also as bad for health. Some denounced it as a foreign practice introduced by European Christians for the purpose of harming Muslims. Tobacco was also damned by its association with the coffee house, where much smoking took place, and when Murad IV closed the coffee houses, he also outlawed tobacco smoking with the death penalty for violators. Expansion, revolutions, and reform. The Ottoman state's geographic position was an important advantage from its beginning well into the height of its power in the 17th century. The early empire was born on the dividing line between Europe and Asia and balanced between them for nearly its entire existence. The collapse of the Byzantine Empire allowed the Ottoman Sultan to rule from a capital city situated between the two continents. After establishing his new capital in Istanbul, Mehmed II issued a call for citizens of the empire to come and settle there to restore its economic vitality. Figure 416. This was necessary because the city had experienced steady demographic decline over the previous few centuries. At first, Mehmed offered free housing to anyone who moved there voluntarily. Later, he ordered thousands of Serbs, Armenians, Greeks, Jewish people, and Turks to settle in the city. Although he would not live to see it, within a century Istanbul was by far the largest city in Europe, with nearly 500,000 residents, and it dominated the land and sea trade between Europe and Asia. An image of two men on a yellow mosaic background is shown. The man on the left has a black beard, wears a long blue robe with gold accents and gold trim, a large white turban with a red top on his head, and a serious expression. He holds a scroll with text on it in his left hand and a handkerchief in his right. The man on the right facing him has a white beard, wears a blue gown with a red cape over his shoulders, and also has a serious expression on his face. On his head he wears a black cloth with a cross in the middle. He extends his left hand to the other man and holds a walking cane in his right hand. Castle walls are behind them. Figure 4. 16 maimed II and Gennadio's II. This 18th century mosaic shows maimed II, left, handing Gennadio's II a document officially recognizing Gennadios' position as the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of the new capital of Istanbul. Credit, modification of work, Gennadio's II and maimed II, by Ecumenical Patriarchate / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Over the next century, the Ottoman Empire extended its influence into Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Under Ottoman control, the Egyptian Red Sea Fleet battled the Portuguese for dominance in the Indian Ocean, sending troops and armaments to aid allied rulers in India and ships to the Straits of Malacca. The Ottoman Empire is generally considered to have reached its pinnacle by the rise of Sultan Sulayman I in 1520. During his reign, Ottoman armies continued their Balkan expansion by conquering Serbia and Hungary, and in 1529 they laid siege to Vienna, then the seat of the Habsburg Empire. Although Vienna was never conquered, the threat of military conquest by the Ottomans was a constant worry for the Habsburgs. Queen Elizabeth I of England, also a rival of the Habsburgs, sent an embassy and military advisors to Istanbul to propose an anti-Habsburg alliance. Despite the Ottoman alliance with England, the Ottomans' war with the Habsburgs quickly reached a stalemate, where it remained for several decades. Ottoman territorial expansion in North Africa found its farthest limit to the west in modern Algeria. To the east, it reached the shores of the Persian Gulf and established official borders with Safavid Iran. In Europe, Sulayman's strength and military dominance of the Mediterranean world, along with the splendor of his capital city and the riches flowing through the empire, earned him the title, the Magnificent. To most Ottomans, however, Sulayman was known as the Lawgiver. Most Ottoman subjects were unaware of their legal rights until Sulayman's rule. Although Ottoman law was based on Sharia, a certain amount of interpretation was required in matters such as criminal law, management of lands, and tax law. These laws were thus usually established by decree. Over the course of 2.5 centuries, different parts of the empire were subject to decrees issued by many sultans, often substantially different from one another and sometimes contradictory. Sulayman reviewed the laws, ensured their compliance with Islamic principles, and issued a single unified law code for the empire that remained in force for 3 centuries. He also ordered the new law code to be publicized widely, so every Ottoman subject knew they had the right to have disputes heard in a court of law and judged fairly. These reforms won Sulayman wide acclaim and popularity as a ruler who cared about his people. Sulayman died in 1566 while commanding an expedition into Hungary. His death was kept secret for 2 months so as not to demoralize the troops. It was not until they returned to Istanbul that his death was made public in time for the coronation of his son as Selim II. The period of Ottoman history after Sulayman's rule has often been described by historians as a time of slow decline, leading to the empire's disintegration beginning in the 19th century. This largely European interpretation attributes the ebbing of Ottoman power to 2 factors: the rise of European military might and Ottoman territorial overextension. In this view, the winds of change began to blow in 1571, when the Ottoman navy was destroyed in a naval battle at Lepanto in Greece by the Holy League, a confederation of the Spanish Empire, the Papal States, Venice, and Genoa, among others. The battle effectively ended Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean, as well as Ottoman enthusiasm for continuing its naval rivalry with Portugal, the Netherlands, and France in the Indian Ocean. With this loss, the curtain was drawn back on the legend of Ottoman invincibility. European military technology caught up to and then surpassed Ottoman capabilities over the 17th and 18th centuries. Ottoman territory was then gradually lost to European kingdoms, particularly in the western part of North Africa and in the Balkans. While the empire's land wars against the Habsburgs in Europe continued for another century, culminating in yet another failed siege of Vienna in 1683. It was also recognized at court that foreign wars were becoming more expensive, but leading to far less economic and territorial gain. From the north, the growing power of Russia became another threat. Beginning in the 17th century, Russian forces pushed south across the steppes toward Ottoman territory. Under Tsar Peter the Great, Russian armies temporarily captured the Ottoman-held territory of Azov in the Crimea along the Black Sea in 1696. In the late 18th century, Russia's expansion ramped up again, eventually leading it deep into Ottoman territory with control over the northern coast of the Black Sea. Often aided by Austria, Russia steadily undermined Ottoman control over the Balkans, and over the 19th century, its influence came to replace Ottoman sway in the region. More recently, historians have refined this older interpretation of Ottoman decline. According to the newer view, the threats from Europe in the west and the Safavids in the east convinced the Ottoman rulers to try making their control over their core territory more efficient. They sent delegations to several countries in Europe and to Mughal India to observe local systems and make recommendations for improvements at home. Several European military advisors were brought to Istanbul to train soldiers, and Ottoman scientists and engineers were sent to European universities to learn more about engineering, history, and military modernization, and the ways in which they could be applied at home. Although the Ottoman Empire had become weaker by the 19th century, these reforms nevertheless helped it to survive into the 20th century. Science and technology. As the Ottoman state grew in prestige and size, its sultans deliberately set out to become patrons of science and learning, following the examples set by the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs and other prominent Muslim leaders. The core of all education was religious. There was no separation between what today would be considered religious philosophy or doctrinal study, and the hard sciences such as astronomy, chemistry, mathematics, and physics. On the contrary, scientific investigation was considered an act of devotion because of its exploration and discovery of the intricacies of the divinely created universe. From the very beginning of the state, institutions of higher learning, madrasas, were established in major cities. Patronage of science, art, and culture reached a new level under Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed founded the first institution of higher learning in the new capital, the Fatih Complex, which included a hospital, public kitchens, a library, and schools. The Fatih Hospital remained operational into the 19th century. As Istanbul developed as the imperial capital, many other such institutions came to be established there. Another complex of charitable institutions, the first one designed and built in Istanbul by Mimar Sinan, the master architect and engineer of Armenian origin, was a teaching hospital endowed by Hurrem Sultan, the wife of Sultan Suleiman. It was also common for wealthy Jewish and Christian patrons to establish their own vakfs to fund projects that benefited their communities, because these trusts were exempt from inheritance taxes. Teaching hospitals were considered important recipients of vakf funds, given that hospital care was provided free of charge. The geographic diversity of the empire was an advantage to the development of medical science, because it was now possible to compare the results of medical treatments and experiments in several different geographic and climate zones. For this reason, many important medical treatises of the day were written in the Ottoman Empire. The tradition of medical writing built upon the foundation established by such famous Muslim scholars and physicians as Ibn Sina, who composed the canon of medicine in the 10th century. The works produced by physicians who made their home in the Ottoman Empire included one of the first treatises dedicated to dentistry, written by the Spanish Jewish scholar Musa bin Hammon, who made his home in the Ottoman Empire after the Jewish people were expelled from Spain. In their own words, the architect of an empire, Mimar Sinan was the chief architect of the Ottoman Empire. Of Armenian origin, he was a member of the Devshirme as a youth and began his career as a military engineer in the Janissary Corps. He first came to the attention of the Sultan Suleiman after he was able to construct a bridge over marshland that was impeding the progress of the Ottoman army. Sinan lived to be nearly 100 years old and designed more than 300 structures, figure 4. 17. An image of a stone-arched bridge over water is shown. Buildings are on the hills surrounding the water. Hills with trees and farmland are visible in the background, figure 4. 17. The Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic Bridge. The Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic Bridge in Visegrad, Bosnia and Herzegovina, was built by Mimar Sinan in 1577 and placed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2007. Credit: Modification of work, Visegrad, Bosnia, Austro-Hungary, by Library of Congress / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In writing his autobiography toward the end of his life, Sinan had this to say about the start of his illustrious career. When Sultan Suleiman set out for Moldavia and arrived on the banks of the river Pruth, a bridge was needed for the army to cross. Since it was a marshy place, they were bewildered as to how to build a bridge. His Excellency the late Lutfi Pasha said, "My felicitous Padishah, the construction of this bridge can be achieved with the skill and ability of your servant Sinan. He is a master of the world and a skilled architect. In 10 days I built a noble bridge and the army of Islam and the Shah of humankind crossed it. By the grace of God, the office of chief architect fell vacant." Lutfi Pasha said, "The architect must be Sinan. There is no one capable of this work other than him." It was true that the thought of abandoning my career as a janissary gave me pain, but in the end I accepted, seeing it as an opportunity to build many mosques and thereby fulfill many desires in this world and the next. Howard Crane and Esra Akin, Sinan's autobiographies, 5 16th century texts, translated and adapted from Mimar Sinan, Tezkiretu, Adjective El Bunyan. What is the military role of an architect? How did Sinan come to fill it? Why was Sinan convinced to abandon his role as a janissary and pursue architecture? Link to learning. Take this virtual tour of the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, Turkey, one of Mimar Sinan's greatest monuments. Rotate your view of the mosque by dragging your mouse or using the wheel on the left of your screen. Among the great scientists of the Ottoman Empire was Taqi al-Din, who was invited by Sultan Murad III to build an observatory in Istanbul, figure 4. 18. Taqi al-Din's method of calculating the coordinates of stars is said to have been better than those of Tycho Brahe and Nicolaus Copernicus, noted astronomers working in northern Europe around the same time. Taqi al-Din also developed steam turbines and mechanical clocks and conducted research into the optical refraction of light. His work illustrates the way scientific discoveries transcended religious and national divisions. He himself had set out to improve on astronomical techniques devised by Ulugh Beg at Samarkand, in today's Uzbekistan. And in turn, his own research was consulted by Tycho Brahe in Denmark, when Brahe was developing his ideas about astronomy. Taqi al-Din's works were also collected by the Dutch mathematician Jacob Golius, who brought them to the library of Leiden University in the Netherlands in the 17th century. A painting of 10 men working with astronomical instruments along a long brown table is shown. One man stands in the top right corner holding his hands, watching all the others under a striped, colorful picture. All the men have beards, wear white turbans and solid-colored long robes. Various astronomical instruments lay across the table and each of the 10 men holds an instrument. Figure 4. 18. The scientific work of Taqi al-Din. Scientists and their astronomical instruments are depicted in Taqi al-Din's Istanbul Observatory in this 1581 miniature by an unknown painter. Credit: Ottoman astronomers at work around Taqi al-Din at the Istanbul Observatory. By Shahinshanaim, Istanbul University Library, Muslim Heritage, Public Domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the factors that contributed to the rise of the Safavid Empire. Discuss the similarities and differences between Twelver Islam and Sunni Islam. Describe the political structure of the Safavid Empire. To the east of the lands of the Ottomans, another Islamic empire emerged at the beginning of the 16th century. Based in Iran, the Safavid Empire at its height ruled over much of what is now Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Georgia, and Iraq, as well as parts of several neighboring countries including Turkey, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Figure 4. 19. Like the Ottomans and Mughals, the Safavids developed a powerful military, ran a strong and well-organized central state, and fostered a climate in which artistic and intellectual culture flourished. The Safavids also introduced Shi'ism as the state religion at a time when Iran's population was mostly Sunni, and in doing so, they fostered the deep divisions between Shi'ism and Sunnism that continue to characterize relations between Iran and other Islamic nations today. A map shows a piece of Northeast Africa and the Middle East, an area north and south of the Black Sea extending down into Africa and small strips along both sides of the Red Sea and along the west side of the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, are highlighted orange and labeled Ottoman Empire. A section in the eastern portion of the orange color from Van Galu, Lake Van, down to the Persian Gulf has green dots on top of the orange highlights. An area from west of the Caspian Sea south to the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman is highlighted green and labeled Safavid Empire. An area just north of that to just south of Idar Kul is pink with green dots. North of Idar Kul and extending to the top of the map is highlighted pink and labeled Uzbek. Figure 4. 19. The Safavid Empire. This map shows the Safavid Empire green at its greatest extent, including disputed territories dots, where the Safavids found themselves in conflict with the Ottoman Empire, orange, and the Uzbek rulers of the Khanate of Bukhara, purple. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. The rise of the Safavid Empire. The Safavids began not as a political dynasty, but as the hereditary leaders of a Sufi order based in the city of Ardabil, located in today's northwestern Iran. The order in Ardabil was founded in the 13th century by the Sufi master Zad Jilani, and little is known about its beliefs and practices in its earliest stages. We do know that Zad appointed his son-in-law and disciple Safi al-Din Ardabili to succeed him, which angered his family and some of his followers. Safi al-Din renamed the order after himself, Safaviya, and made a number of reforms that reshaped it from a local order to a religious movement that sought followers from around Iran and neighboring countries. While Safi al-Din's origins are lost to history, it is generally believed that he came from a family of Azeri-speaking Kurds, although even this is uncertain. Azeri is a Turkic language. The Safavid family later claimed that Safi al-Din was descended from the Prophet through Muhammad's daughter Fatima and son-in-law Ali ibn Abi Talib. This genealogy was most likely invented by court historians during the 16th century reign of Shah Ismail I. However, several scholars went one step further and extended the family's history back to the biblical Adam. Initially, like most of Iran's population, the Safavids were primarily Sunni Muslims. Like that of many Sufi orders, their ideology incorporated elements of both Sunni and Shia doctrines to proclaim a universal message, and attract followers from both sects. However, Safi al-Din's great-grandson Junaid made several changes to the order's doctrine, adopting specifically Shia ideas. Junaid believed the Safavids should use their popular religious mandate to seek military and political power for themselves, and he found Shia doctrine more appropriate for his vision. Junaid's son Haydar created a solid political and military framework by establishing a Safavid military order known as the Kizilbash, after their distinctive red hats. Kizil means red in Azeri. Haydar declared a religious war against the Christian residents of the Caucasus, but in order to reach them, he had to pass through the territory of the Shirvanshahs, who were allied with his enemies. Although at first he was able to negotiate safe passage for his army, the Shirvanshahs, already uneasy about Haydar's growing power, used his eventual attack on one of their cities as an excuse to declare war on the Safavids. Haydar was killed in battle in 1488. His son Ali Mirza took his place, but within a few years his capital at Ardabil was conquered by his enemies. Ali Mirza was also killed, and his infant brother Ismail was sent into exile. After being sheltered by allies, the 12-year-old Ismail emerged from exile in 1499, claiming to be the Mahdi or Messiah, and began rallying the Kizilbash troops who had fought for his father and brother. They embarked on a military campaign, winning victory after victory until, in July 1501, Ismail entered the Shirvanshah capital of Tabriz and declared himself Shah, or Emperor, of all Iran, figure 420. At the time, he governed only Azerbaijan and part of the Caucasus. By 1511, however, Ismail's troops had driven the Uzbek people across the Oxus River, establishing the eastern borders of modern Iran. The Safavids also staged incursions into eastern Anatolia. These triggered a conflict with the Ottoman Empire that continued for the length of the Safavids' reign. Not only had Ismail's forces occupied the empire's border cities, but he had begun recruiting for his army among the ethnic Turkish tribes of eastern Anatolia, and encouraging the Shia Muslims in Ottoman lands to revolt against their Sunni rulers. A painting of a profile of a man on a black background is shown. He has red hair and beard, and wears a woven white round hat. He wears a brown coat over a white shirt with red trim. The words Ismail Rex and Sophie Pur appears at the top of the painting. Figure 420 Shah Ismail. The Safavid Empire was as ethnically diverse as the Ottoman Empire. In this portrait of Shah Ismail by an Italian painter of the 16th century, for example, the Shah's reddish hair, possibly an inheritance from his Greek grandmother, is clearly visible. Credit: Portrait of Shah Ismail I of Persia by Uffizi Gallery/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In response, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II deported the sheikhs of his empire from Anatolia to other regions, where they would be unable to heed the Safavid call. As the Safavids continued to push westward into Ottoman territory, Bayezid's son Selim I responded by invading Iranian Azerbaijan, laying waste to Tabriz in 1514, and attempting to destroy the Kizilbash. The loss of his capital Tabriz to the enemy, and to a Sunni Muslim at that, was a huge blow to Shah Ismail standing among his own armies, made worse by the fact that he had declared himself invincible based on his fictionalized semi-divine ancestry. After Ismail's death in 1524, 10 years of internal strife followed as rival Kizilbash factions fought for dominance and the right to be regent to Ismail's 10-year-old heir Tahmasp. Tahmasp went on to become the longest-reigning Safavid Shah. Disappointed by his experience navigating the rivalries within the Kizilbash, he began using enslaved Christians from Circassia and Georgia in the palace administration and civil services instead of members of the Kizilbash. Tahmasp faced several challenges at home and abroad, however. Although he successfully repelled an attempt by the Uzbeks to invade northeastern Iran, they remained a threat to the east, and war with the Ottomans flared up soon afterward when Sulayman's armies invaded Iran in the mid-1530s. Tahmasp's desire to fend off the Turkish threat led him to ally himself with a rising European power, the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburg Emperor Charles V, concerned by the Ottomans' progression toward Vienna, approached first Ismail and then Tahmasp about an alliance. By agreement, the Safavids would attack the Ottomans whenever the Ottomans attacked the Habsburgs, to divide the Ottoman army between two fronts of battle and thereby weaken it. In 1536, the Ottomans formalized their own alliance with the King of France, an enemy of the Habsburgs, who sent a military advisor to counsel Sultan Sulayman about his war with Iran in 1547. 2 decades of warfare severely strained the Iranian economy, however, and Tahmasp sought peace with the Ottomans. Under the Peace of Amasya, concluded in 1555, Armenia and Georgia were divided between the two empires. The Ottomans gained control over Iraq and access to the Persian Gulf, while Iran's control over Azerbaijan was guaranteed. Tahmasp also moved his capital from Tabriz to Kazvin, closer to the Caspian Sea, and at less risk of capture or siege by Ottoman forces. The two states finally laid down arms and declared a peace that lasted more than 30 years. It did not last forever, however. The borders of Iran were secure at the end of Tahmasp's reign, but his son and grandson were ineffective leaders who failed to keep the Kizilbash rivalries from once again destabilizing the country, which led to yet more incursions by Ottoman and Uzbek forces. Tahmasp's grandson Abbas I, generally considered the strongest Safavid Shah as well as one of the greatest rulers in Iranian history, found himself compelled to take up arms once again. Figure 421. During his reign, the Safavid state reached the height of its military, political, and economic power. Abbas I reformed the military and civil service and built a showpiece capital city, Isfahan, which remains one of the masterworks of Persian Islamic art and architecture. A painting of a kneeling man on a lavishly decorated rug is shown. He wears a striped woven turban with a white feather in the front. His long robe has flowers all over, and a red shirt shows by his collar. He has a long mustache and an ornate belt around his waist. His left hand rests on the handle of a sword, and his right hand holds a dish. A cloth in the bottom left of the painting holds vases and bowls, while the arms and legs of two people can be seen in the right edges of the painting. The wall behind him displays two gold vases on a ledge. Figure 421 Shah Abbas I. This detail from a series of 17th-century paintings decorating the walls of the Chehel Satun Palace in Isfahan, Iran, depicts Shah Abbas I, who ruled over Iran at the height of the Safavid dynasty's power. Credit, Abbas I of Persia by Trajan 117, Wikimedia Commons, public domain. By the time the 17-year-old Abbas was crowned Shah in 1588, Iran was in chaos. After waging war against the Uzbeks, Abbas realized that fighting the Ottomans with the country in upheaval would be nearly impossible. As a result, he signed a peace treaty in 1590 that gave nearly half his territory, including the former capital of Tabriz, to the Ottomans. Abbas then returned to the issue his grandfather had taken up, taming the Kizilbash, whose disputes had plunged Iran into civil conflict that twice nearly brought the country to ruin. His grandfather had acquired over 30,000 enslaved people, employed as civil servants and palace administrators. Turning to the Caucasus region again, Abbas decided to also create an enslaved soldier corps like the Ottoman Janissaries. With his new army behind him, Abbas undertook to gain back the territories lost to the Uzbeks and Ottomans. The Safavid armies quickly reconquered Khorasan from the Uzbeks and moved on to Azerbaijan. The Ottomans sued for peace in 1612, relinquishing the Caucasus to the Iranians. An attempt to recapture the territory in 1618 resulted in a devastating loss for the Ottomans. Despite near-constant war, during this time Iran reached new cultural and economic heights. In 1598, Abbas moved his capital from Kazvin to Isfahan in the central Iranian plateau, far from the constantly shifting borders with the Ottomans and Uzbeks, and closer to the Persian Gulf and the newly arrived traders of the British and Dutch East India Companies. The city was built as a showpiece, with administrative buildings and public markets opening on the enormous Nakshi Jahan, exemplar of the world. Square figure 422. A photograph of two long buildings in a L shape is shown. Starting on the left, a long building is shown with a large arched opening and thin towers on either side. The building has many windows on 2 floors and runs the length of the photograph. The right side of the building shows domes and towers rising form the second floor. Along the right side of the photograph, another long building is shown with 2 floors, windows on both levels and awnings coming off of the windows on the lower floor. In front of both buildings are trees, grass, sidewalks, light poles, shrubs, people, and roads. Figure 4. 22 Nakshi Jahan Square. The Shah Mosque, built by Abbas I, is located on the south side of Nakshi Jahan Square in the center of Isfahan. The square, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, still serves as a gathering place today. Credit: Nakshi Jahan Square by Bijan Tehrani/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 20. The city center was unique. All levels of society could mix there, from members of the royal court whose pavilion overlooked the square, to the Shiite clergy whose mosque was at the square's southern end, to foreign dignitaries, members of the military, merchants, and commoners. A soup kitchen distributed free food to the needy, and occasionally the square was cleared for polo games, public ceremonies, and festivals. To populate his new capital, Abbas ordered several different populations to settle in it, including Armenians, Jewish people, Circassians, and other Caucasian peoples, many of whom had been displaced during his war against the Ottomans in their homelands. The cathedral Abbas ordered built for the Armenian Christians still serves that community in Isfahan today. After Abbas' death, the Safavid state met another internal threat, this time from the Georgian kingdom of Kakheti. After Abbas had ordered the mass deportation of Georgians to central Iran, he sent Oghuz Turks, Turkoman, to settle the area. The local population that remained refused to allow them to do so, however, and staged a military rebellion. Although the Safavids were eventually able to reestablish authority, they never achieved their earlier level of control. Iran also continued to face threats from outside. In the early 18th century, under the reign of Tsar Peter the Great, Russia began to encroach on the northern shores of the Caspian Sea and to compete for influence in the Caucasus. The armies of Peter the Great took the Caucasus in the Russo-Persian War of 1722–1723, while the Ottomans reoccupied northwestern Iran. The entry of European ships to the Indian Ocean trade cut off much of Iran's direct access to Africa and South Asia. Over the course of the 1730s, Nader of Shah, one of the Safavid vassals, established himself as a strong military ruler. He was able to reverse many of Iran's territorial losses to the Russians and Ottomans. However, he had no interest in sharing power. In 1736, Nader deposed the infant Abbas III and crowned himself Shah, bringing the Safavid Empire to an end and establishing the short-lived Afsharid dynasty. Establishing Shi'ism as the state religion, the Safavids declared Shia Islam the state religion of Iran in the early 1500s, and it remains so to this day, encompassing about 10% of the worldwide Muslim population. The Shia movement originated with a dispute over Muhammad's successor after his death in 632. One faction, which became known as the Sunnis, supported the candidacy of Abu Bakr al-Sadiq, Muhammad's father-in-law. The other faction wished the leadership to remain within Muhammad's biological family and backed Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, whom they believed the Prophet had chosen as his successor. This group became known as the Shia. The Shia believe Ali, who finally succeeded Uthman to become the leader of the Muslim community in 656, was the first legitimate imam, the title they give their spiritual leader rather than caliph. They view the line of Muhammad that descends through Ali and his wife Fatima, Muhammad's daughter, as the only source of definitive religious guidance. About 95% of Shia also believe Ali was the first of 12 infallible leaders chosen by God, so this sect is often called the Twelvers. Twelvers hold that the 12th and final Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, went into mystical hiding in the 9th century and will return, along with Jesus, to defeat evil on earth and herald the day of judgment. The remaining Shia are either Zaydis, also known as Fivers, or Ismailis, also called Seveners, who disagree with Twelvers over the identities of the 5th and 7th Imams, respectively. The Zaydi sect was established by Zayd, the great-grandson of Ali. Sunnis respect Ali and all the 12 Imams, but they do not believe the 12 alone were divinely chosen to lead the Muslim community. In their view of Islam, any pious man who followed the example of Muhammad could lead the Muslim community. Shi'ism was not officially tolerated by the Sunni caliphs of the Umayyad and Abbasid empires because of its perceived challenge to their rule. For this reason, most Shia movements developed far outside the control of these caliphates, in places like Morocco, Yemen, Iran, and Central Asia. After the Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258, the Sunni Caliphate became a weak figurehead position that held only symbolic authority. During the period of Mongol rule over Iran and the Caucasus, the distinction between Shia and Sunni became less important than it had been. When Ismail crowned himself Shah in 1501, most of Iran's population was Sunni. When he declared Twelver Shi'ism to be the state religion of Iran, he hoped to unify his Iranian subjects by having them adopt a form of Islam that gave them a unique identity and distinguished them from their military and political enemies, the Ottomans and the Uzbeks, who were both Sunni. Historians generally agree that the Safavids' efforts to convert Muslims in their empire to Shi'ism utilized coercion and force. Shah Ismail, who saw himself as infallible and semi-divine, believed his strong religious convictions had won him the Iranian throne, and he used his political and military authority to impose his religious ideology on the country. Figure 4. 23. He ordered all Iran's Sunni Muslims to become Shiites. Sunni clerics and theologians were given the choice of conversion or exile. Sunnis who resisted conversion but remained in Iran faced death. To spread the new beliefs and win converts, Ismail brought Shia scholars to Iran from Lebanon and Syria. He used state funds to construct schools where Shia beliefs were taught and to build shrines to Ali and members of his family. Ismail also invited foreign Shiites living in places where they were persecuted by the Sunni majority to move to Iran, promising them land and protection. An image of a man in a long white coat with black pants and an elaborate hat is shown. He is in the middle of the drawing, standing on a raised platform with a sheath on his belt and a sword raised over his head. Above him, on a brick wall next to a window with a tree in the background, a man stands in flowing robes over a long garment with a turban with loose pieces on his head. His face is not clearly drawn. He is holding a book in his right hand, and his left hand is above the man on the platform. At the bottom left of the drawing, 8 men stand dressed in long dark robes, turbans, hats, and beards. On the bottom right of the drawing, 6 men stand in long robes with ornately decorated hats and mustaches. Many of the men have a finger on their mouths in a thoughtful pose. Script is visible at the top and bottom of the image. Figure 4. 23. Shi'ism as the state religion. In this image from a Persian history of his reign written about 1650, the Safavid ruler Shah Ismail, dressed in white, stands on the steps of a mosque prior to his coronation, having the sermon read in the name of the 12 Imams, and effectively declaring Shi'ism to be the state religion of Iran in 1501. Credit: Shah Ismail, History of Shah Ismail by Muin Musavir, Isfahan, Iran by Muin Musavir / British Library / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The conversion efforts of the Safavids have left long legacies in the Islamic world. Though the majority of Muslims in Azerbaijan and Iran considered themselves Shia, by the time the Safavid era ended in 1736, Nader Shah attempted to restore Sunnism as the dominant sect. But there was little public enthusiasm, and after his death most who had claimed to adopt Sunnism during his reign quietly reverted to Shi'ism. At the same time, however, the Safavids' conversion policy brought tensions between Sunni and Shia to a level not seen since Muhammad's death. The hostility between the sects that continues today is usually traced to the Safavid era and the dynasty's military rivalry with the Ottomans, especially after the Sultan acquired the Sunni title of Caliph in 1517. The Safavids were generally more tolerant of non-Muslim subjects than they were of the Sunni. Nevertheless, Safavid rulers were aggressive toward the Armenians, Georgians, and other Christians in the Caucasus region, whom they considered potentially rebellious. They sought to control these populations by enslaving or deporting their members, and nobles were often requested to convert to Shi'ism. Christians elsewhere in the Safavid realm, however, were given considerable freedom to build churches and honor their own customs and beliefs. Abbas I was particularly lenient toward the Armenian Christian population of Isfahan, due to their participation in the lucrative manufacture and export of silk. Spain and the Vatican sent several embassies to Iran hoping to enlist it as an ally against the Ottomans. The Pope also hoped Abbas would allow the construction of a cathedral in his new capital city of Isfahan, but on their arrival, his emissaries found 3 Roman Catholic churches already there. Figure 4.24. A photograph of an interior of an elaborately decorated room is shown. A small gazebo is located in the right portion of the photograph with a blue starry dome top and a steeple with white grates and a green roof. Part of an altar is shown to the left. The walls of the rest of the room are filled with paintings of people in long robes, women and children, as well as other religious scenes. Around the paintings, the walls are decorated with flowery tiles. Figure 4.24 Holy Savior Cathedral in Isfahan. The interior of the Armenian Christian Holy Savior Cathedral in Isfahan, built in 1606, incorporates both Christian imagery, such as scenes from the life of Christ, and Islamic-style decorative tilework. Credit: Armenian frescoes by David Stanley / Flickr, CC by 20. Safavid government and culture. During the Safavid period, Iran was ethnically quite diverse. Safi al-Din is believed to have come from a family of Kurds who spoke Azeri. As the Safavid order developed, its members intermarried with other Turkic groups such as the Turkoman, Lar, and Bakhtiyari, and with Georgian, Armenian, and Pontic Greek Christians within their lands and bordering territories. Through his mother, Shah Ismail I was descended from the Komnenos dynasty that once ruled the Byzantine Empire. He used Persian as the language of government and composed poetry in Azeri, contributing to its development as a literary language. The Kizilbash were largely Turkoman, another Turkic group with its own language. Various groups of Persian-speaking peoples lived in the Iranian plateau and were usually described as Tajik. The Safavid Shahs were wary of groups that sought to exert too much power over them and the government. One of the reasons the Kizilbash were eventually replaced as palace administrators, bureaucrats, and military elites is that they had occasionally used their collective power to render some of the weaker Shahs mere figureheads. However, beneath the Shah and the powerful elites, the Safavid hierarchy was unique for its time in being largely based on merit. Worth and talent, not status or birth, were the keys to upward mobility. Even those in hereditary positions had to prove themselves capable or be replaced. This system brought the brightest and most talented into government service, while preventing the development of an entrenched and unchecked aristocracy. Shi'ism's rise created a new religious hierarchy in Iran. Given the sect's government sponsorship, the Shia ulama were often able to act as intermediaries between the people and the government. They formed an early alliance with merchants, for instance, establishing and administering vacs to protect the merchants' property and assets. Through this alliance, many members of the ulama became landowners themselves, creating a religious aristocracy that gave them a level of political independence. When the Safavid state weakened in its later years, the ulama were able to step in and use their newly acquired wealth to benefit their communities. This strengthening of direct ties between the ulama and the people, and the separation of the religious establishment from the state, is believed to be one of the reasons Shi'ism long outlasted the Safavid era. The stability of the Safavid system allowed art and culture to flourish. The Safavid era is considered one of the high points of Perso-Islamic culture. Two distinct schools of painting developed: the Turkmen school in western Iran and the Timurid school based in Herat, in today's Afghanistan. Shah Tahmasp supported both schools at a royal painting workshop, where artistic masters were invited to work with luxury materials such as gold leaf and ground lapis lazuli. Figure 4.25. A painting of a bearded man kneeling on a richly decorated rug in a garden is shown. He is wearing a brown short-sleeved long coat embossed with gold flowers over a green long-sleeved shirt with gold flowers. He wears a white turban on his head with a red projection at the top and a silvery feather in the back. His belt holds a short sword in a sheath and objects dangling from elaborate flowery decorations. In the background, a tree, flowers, rock, and grass can be seen. Figure 4.25. Shah Tahmasp. This detail of a 16th century miniature by the Persian artist Farrukh Beg shows Shah Tahmasp, who was a great patron of the arts. The patterns on Tahmasp's robe have been embellished with gold. Credit: Shah Tahmasp in the Mountains by Freer Gallery of Art/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. One of the most famous achievements of Tahmasp's workshop was an illustrated version of the Shahnameh, the national epic of Iran, written by the poet Ferdowsi in the 10th century. Safavid miniature painting remains one of the most prized examples of visual art. Iranian ceramics became highly valued for export because of their remarkable similarity in style and quality to treasured Chinese porcelain, with even more intricately painted decorations. Some Safavid ceramic artists went so far as to place a fake Chinese workshop stamp on the back of their products to increase their value. Beyond the book. The art of the book, the most distinctive and prized artworks of the Safavid era, were illuminated manuscripts of well-known texts decorated with miniature paintings. In these paintings, artists used mineral-based dyes, which produced brilliant and long-lasting colors. Figure 426. Wealthy patrons commissioned artists, like those in the studio of Shah Tahmasp, to paint these miniatures either to illustrate books or to be kept as a separate piece of art in an album of similar works. A highly detailed painting of a mountain with flowers, animals, trees, and large purple leaves is shown. Three people in the middle of the mountain are sitting on colorful rugs in long gowns and robes with gold-decorated hats around a fire. They hold small objects in their hands. Around the fire there are bowls, vases, and plates of food. Behind the mountain on the top left people in robes and hats hold animals in large pots. On the right, three people are shown at the edge of the painting in colorful clothing. Toward the bottom middle, two people sit on either side of the fire in richly decorated clothing. At the bottom of the painting, animals are shown along a river, and one man is standing petting a goat. Script writing appears at the top right and bottom of the painting. Figure 4.26. The Feast of Sada. This Persian miniature produced in the studio of Shah Tahmasp depicts the Feast of Sada, a mythical event that celebrates the discovery of fire. Credit: The Feast of Sada, folio 22V from the Shahnameh Book of Kings of Shah Tahmasp, by Ferdowsi/Metropolitan Museum of Art, gift of Arthur A. Houghton Jr., 1970/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The art of these miniature paintings relies on a style called non-representational. Instead of depicting a scene naturalistically, it uses forced or even impossible perspectives to show action on multiple tiers, revealing activity behind doors or walls that some of the subjects in the painting cannot see. The subjects, even if they sponsored the work, are generally idealized rather than actual persons. Representation of the human form has been forbidden in Islamic art at times. In Persian illuminated manuscripts, the artist's response was to use the image to bring a specific person to the viewer's mind without representing them accurately. Miniatures were an important form of Persian art long before Islam appeared. Persian artists were prized at the court of the Abbasids, and artistic styles derived from their work, such as the non-figurative elements used in the borders of miniatures, were later used to decorate manuscripts of the Quran. Despite the strong rivalry between the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, all three empires produced paintings of this type, figure 427. While strongly influenced by Persian miniatures, Mughal miniatures tended to represent a more realistic depiction of animals and humans. A colorful image shows groups of people and animals on a countryside. At the top, two hills are shown, one with a steeple and trees showing, while the middle one shows a man in blue shorts and a cloth flowing from his arms running away from another man. A house sits at the top of the hill. The right top of the image shows a gold castle behind a large tree filled with birds. The middle of the picture shows three erect animals in pants and cloth robes with gold crowns on their heads, speaking with two people in yellow robes sitting under the large tree. The bottom of the image shows more animals in clothes, bushes, a stream, monkeys, geese, swans, fish, and deer around the water. Script text appears near the top and bottom of the image. Figure 4:27, an image of Rama. This miniature, created in the Mughal Empire in 1594, shows a scene from the Ramayana, a Sanskrit epic of Rama, an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu. Rama, seated beneath the tree beside his brother Lakshmana, addresses Hanuman, the Monkey King. Credit: modification of work miniature from the Ramayana, India, Mughal, 1594 by Richard Mortal. The David Collection, Copenhagen/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 2. 0. Safavid miniatures are highly prized today. Some of the best examples have sold for millions of dollars at auction. What are the common features of the Safavid and Mughal paintings? How are their styles similar? What might account for the differences in style between the Safavid and Mughal paintings? As Tahmasp's royal studio was to painting, Abba's capital at Isfahan was to architecture. While Nakshi Jahan Square provided a focus, the city also featured a broad tree-lined avenue called the Chahar Bagh, stretching over 4 kilometers from the square to a royal country estate, figure 428. This street was flanked by palaces and public gardens that featured fruit trees and fountains with running water. The city was designed as a treat for the senses, employing artistic motifs in tilework and calligraphy, broad sweeping arches and domes that mimicked the sky, the sounds of running water and wind blowing through leaves, and the sense of flowering shrubs and trees carried on the breeze. Later Safavid Shahs continued to expand Isfahan, adding buildings, avenues, and bridges, and commissioning structures in other cities based on the style cultivated in the capital. Many of these are now symbols of Iranian nationhood. A photograph of a bridge with arched sections at the bottom and top is shown at night. Lights reflect from inside the top portion, and the entire bridge reflects in the water below. Figure 4:28, the Co-Sepal Bridge in Isfahan. The Co-Sepal, 33 arches, bridge in Isfahan, built between 1599 and 1602, carries the broad avenue called Chahar Bagh across the Zayanderud River. Credit: Co-Sepal, 33 bridges, or the Bridge of 33 Arches, also called the Aliverdi Khan Bridge, by Raza Hajipur/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 3. 0. As in the Ottoman Empire, wealthy Safavid women raised their public stature by becoming patrons of the arts and endowing public buildings. Royal and elite women often funded the construction or maintenance of caravansaries, demonstrating the value of trade to both the state and individual wealth. Safavid art and artistic production reflected Iran's location at the center of global trade routes, incorporating elements and styles from countries with which Iran conducted trade. The production of silk was one of the most important industries in Iran. Persian carpets of silk and wool were in high demand in Europe and other parts of the Islamic world. The Ardabil carpet, still one of the largest Persian carpets in existence, was made during the Safavid period. It is 3412 by 1712 feet and is on view at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. Link to learning. View images of the famous Ardabil carpet at the Victoria and Albert Museum website to see it in detail, and also get a sense of its enormous size.